Hello there. Thanks for tuning in to Under the Dome on Town Meeting TV. My name's Bobby Lucier. We are a few weeks out from the end of the session here, but we're still rolling with the Under the Dome program. We've got more conversation to have about all of the work that's been done this session. And we're talking today about education, and we're joined by some legislators from Chittenden County. We've got Representatives Sarita Austin and Mary Catherine Stone, and Senator Martine LaRocque-Ulick. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Bobby.
Okay, so why don't we start with some brief introductions, if you could just share what district you all represent and what committee you serve on and how long you've been in the legislature. And we can start with you, Representative Austin.
I'm Representative Sarita Austin, and I represent Colchester 19, which is the Malletts Bay side of Colchester. I'm on the Education Committee, and this is ending my 6th year in the legislature.
Senator Gulick.
Hi, I am Senator Martine LaRocque-Ulick, and I represent Chittenden Central. I live here in Burlington, and I am Vice Chair of the Education Committee, and I serve also on Health and Welfare. Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming. Representative Stone.
Hi, I'm Representative Mary Catherine Stone. I represent Chittenden 14 in Burlington along with Representative Barbara Rachelson. I am the newest kid on the block, literally, because my district used to be a 1-seat district up until this last biennium, where it was drawn in. So I'm finishing up my first biennium, and I serve as clerk on the House Committee on Education.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Before we jump in, I want to recognize we did lose a couple of legislators in the last couple of weeks. Senator Dick Sears, Senator Dick Mazza. Folks have been doing a lot of public service to the state over the course of many years here, and I want to just, I guess, create some space if any of you would like to say a couple of words about either of those senators and their work for our state.
I can say something about Senator Mazza, not only as a senator and a very influential senator, but he epitomized for me kind of the essence of what a good politician was. He listened, I think he was fair, he was equitable, he listened to everybody, he represented everybody. But in addition to that, he was in my district. He was, the store, the Mazda store that everybody goes to. And he was extremely generous, not very humble, but very generous, in terms of fundraisers and helping, the library and the Historical Society. And it's hard to put into words how one person can be that powerful, and being very kind of low key. And he just had that ability. And it's a huge vacuum, I feel, that's been left in Colchester. And we'll see what happens. Vacuums tend to get filled up. But right now we're suffering with a huge loss to our community and in Montpelier.
Yeah, and I would just want to add to that. I served with both Senators Mazza and Senator Sears in the Senate, and I'm just a first term. I'm just ending my first term in the Senate, so I was definitely a newbie coming in, and I would just say both of those incredible gentlemen were so helpful to me and so kind. And what I really enjoyed was observing them in action and seeing how they behave in the Senate, how they treat their colleagues. My colleague, Senator Tanya Vyhovsky, was on Judiciary with Senator Sears, and I learned a lot about him through her. And I am just sad that I didn't get to know both of them better, but I was so thankful to be able to spend 2 sessions in the biennium with them and learn from their expertise. Big loss.
Senator Vyhovsky was on this program a few days ago and actually mentioned Senator Sears as an example of someone that she was able to work across difference and opinions about things to get things done. Yeah. So thank you for chiming in on that, and we'll keep both of their families in mind. Okay, so thanks. Thank you for that. So let's start now to talk about education. The big picture hear, maybe just starting at the 10,000 foot, what's going well in our schools and what are the challenges? And then maybe after that we can dig into some of the bills that you've all worked on. Do you want to start, Representative Stone?
Yeah, I would say it's a blessing and a curse. I feel like for the first time this biennium, all eyes are on education. I'm really proud of my committee and the work that we've done over the past 2 years, but I mean, there's so many pressing issues that are happening in our community alone, the homelessness crisis, the opioid epidemic, the list goes on and on and on, and I feel like finally, for now, for better or for worse, my constituents are really engaged regarding education, whether it be the news around the Secretary of Ed's appointment, the issues that we have with education funding, the questions that we have around PCB remediation. I know a lot of these things we're going to touch on today, but there's a lot going on, and I would say the blessing now is that I feel like all eyes are on education right now, and the time is ripe to make some crucial and critical decisions because we are at a crossroads right now.
I would echo what my colleague Mary Catherine Stone said. I couldn't agree with her more. There's kind of a never-ending list of challenges right now. What I would want to point out as strength is we have incredible students in our state with incredible talent, passion, and creativity. I can't wait. I'm going to be speaking at the Burlington Tech Center graduation next week, and I am so honored to be able to speak to a group of high school students who I just find them so incredibly they just warm my heart and they give me hope for the future. So I'm really looking forward to that. I would also just say we have incredible teachers, principals, and superintendents in this state, and I don't think we celebrate them and recognize them enough. They are amazing. They are in there every day with our kids, providing them with what they need, whether it be food, emotional support, actual academic learning. I just want to recognize both of those groups of folks who are amazing. And I mean, I should not leave our staff out either, because I hear stories about folks working in cafeterias. I hear bus drivers who make a difference in our kids' lives every single day. So thank you to those folks and the kids.
Thank you, Senator.
Yeah.
So I looked at the challenges and then what's going well, and I think it's kind of historically been building up to what I think of as this perfect storm that kind of hit us this session. And so we have lowering enrollment. We've gone from 140,000 students to 83,000. So that impacts, the tax revenue that we have. I feel like we didn't give enough time, or I feel like the federal government didn't give enough time to the transition out of COVID. I think the expectation is they'd hit the ground running, and we got caught up in kind of the mental health, the kind of psychological impact of what our students and staff went through during those 2 years. So I think that was challenging. I think our schools are taking on more responsibilities than we have in the past. We're feeding kids, we're addressing mental health. We're just taking on more of the social services than we have in the past. And I think the increase in healthcare costs for teachers, kind of that negotiation, that added to the perfect storm, and lack of teachers, lack of quality teachers. I mean, there were just fewer teachers. There was a huge emptiness in terms of being able to hire teachers at the kind of beginning of this session. I think what's going really well is that we're back in school. I think being back in school is, the best case scenario for everybody. I think child care is getting up and running, so that will help, working parents. We have now reports on, we're going to probably talk about school construction, literacy, BOCES. I mean, we have some very exciting programs and initiatives starting off. And just looking at the future of education, looking ahead at what is the future of education and what is the funding that will make it sustainable and affordable, but high quality.
As a reminder, if you are tuning in live, you can call in with your question for our representatives here at 802-862-3966. You can call in and we'll put your question right on the air for our representatives here. I think when folks are thinking about education, especially now, especially in this session, the question that comes to mind first is the funding question. And I think it might be helpful for each of you to clarify, first of all, to talk a little bit about some of the cost drivers, what's making our education so expensive in the state, but also what the role is of the education committees, both in the House and the Senate, as it relates to the property taxes that folks are seeing go up this year. If any of you want to start.
I think I can piggyback a little bit on what Representative Austin was kind of alluding to. She talked about healthcare costs. She talked about declining enrollment. So there, and then the end of federal funding after COVID, which frankly, I think we're going to be digging out of COVID for at least 10 years. So for the federal government to say, here, have this money, and then suddenly take it away after a year or two just seems very problematic to me. It's going to be a long time, and we see it not just in our schools, but look around. The opioid crisis was exacerbated, homelessness was exacerbated. There's just so much. It seems like we had these really thin margins that were kind of pushed over during COVID, and we're dealing with that. I think it's important for us to understand that there is a cost to education. We need to talk about it. The narrative that we often hear is just that it's too high, it's too much. Not everyone needs to be paying for it. I do want to bring the conversation back once in a while to why do we have education? Why do we have public education? What does it serve us in a democracy, and why is it important? Why is it a common good? I think these are conversations that we need to have, and just saying that it's too much, although that could be true, but without digging into it and really teasing that apart a little bit, it's I don't want to say it's meaningless, but it's problematic. One of the things that Representative Austin didn't talk about, but we all should talk about, is just decisions that are made in the legislature. So back in 2007, you've heard me talk about this before, when we chose to put a moratorium on school construction. That's fine, but the bottom line is, when we own a house, we have to do maintenance every year, and the same is true for our schools. So those bills are starting to come due, and frankly, the neglect that we've seen over the past several years is really starting to accumulate. It's something that we're going to have to pay for. I also think we've seen a really, our property values skyrocketing, and that was really something that, again, like that bill came due. We've sort of been keeping rates low over time, and it caught up with us. So that's something that we need to recognize. And then other decisions like Act 173 in the legislature, which we can talk about a little bit more. But these decisions do have consequences, and that's something that hopefully we're going to talk about, especially when we talk about the commission a little bit later. Yeah.
And I would say the thing to remember is we did not get into this situation overnight, and we're not going to get out of it overnight. The purpose of the Ed Fund is to pay for all budgets that are approved by local voters, and once they vote, we have to fund what they approve. And in the legislature, we really have limited tools to bring down the cost, since the school budgets are voted on locally. And that varies state to state. That's something that in Vermont we have a lot of local control, for better or for worse. And things we can't control, healthcare costs for our teachers are bargained at a state level. Mental health care, we've heard in testimony that there are federal funds that are not being drawn down, and getting to the why of that. Is it because our agencies are understaffed? I mean, that's not really a question, that's a fact. Our Agency of Education is understaffed. We didn't even have a Secretary of Education appointed for close to a year. So the first year of my biennium, when we're writing bills that refer to the Secretary of Education, I kept saying, who is that? Because we just had an interim for a year, and we actually still just have an interim. There are other conversations that may not be popular that could contribute to driving down the cost. Ending early college, a program that people like. Tackling another hot topic, tuitioning. We have the oldest voucher system in the United States. We have public funds going to schools that don't have to adhere to public rules and don't have the same oversight, including oversight of their finances. So, again, this is a really complex topic when we talk about how do we get here. And again, we didn't get here overnight, and we're not going to be able to get out of this overnight. And there were solutions thrown out by the governor to borrow against the future, borrow against next year's school budgets, but that's really not driving down the cost. All that's doing is kicking the can down the road. And thankfully, our current state treasurer intervened, Mike Pichek, and said, borrowing against the future is not a good idea. But we did use some one-time funding this year to buy down the tax rate. But I'm really proud of the work that we did in the yield bill, particularly the policy work that the House Committee on Education did to put forth a commission on the future of public education, because we're really going to need to look at long-term, sustainable, and oftentimes issues that are going to require a lot of political fortitude to get us out of the situation that we're in now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You mentioned the Commission on the Future of Public Education. So this was a commission that was established. It sounded like the House was considering a few different ways to radically change the way that we fund education this year, and ultimately settled on, let's establish a commission that will have that conversation. But could we talk about what that commission will look like, and just the questions facing that commission, and at least from your perspective as folks who work on education policy, what do you want to see changed in the education system, the way that we fund it and the way that the way that we educate our students in Vermont?
You want to go?
Sure. So I always start at graduation. What do we, when we have a 12th grader leave our schools? What are the skills, knowledge, attitudes, understandings that we want that student to have so they can be successful, in whatever path they choose? And then I back down in terms of what do they need in 12th grade and go down to kindergarten, because that's our role. Our role is to advance learning. That used to be our role. I think it's expanding, but that used to be our role. And I think we have to have a serious conversation about local control. There's, the Miami-Dade School District is the same size as they have 643,000 kids in their school district. They have one superintendent and one school board. I'm not saying I want that for Vermont, but I think it's expensive, the system that we have now. So we might have to reach a compromise a little bit more about the state having a little bit more input into what education funding is going to look like, and just take a little bit from everybody having their say, because it's expensive. And like Catherine said, it's unsustainable. And I think that's the word, that we're using. We have to create a system that is sustainable. And right now it is not sustainable. We cannot have, 14 and 20% increases every year after year. So, I just think we have to look at efficiencies. We're looking at BOCES. I think we have to look at some more consolidation. I think we need to be creative about how do we provide a quality education that's affordable.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Representative Austin said, and I think she's spot on. I would just add a couple things about the commission. One is that it's not solely looking at finance, so this commission will be kind of putting everything on the table. One of the things we hear a lot in the legislature is that we don't have a statewide curriculum, for example. Why not? Is that a good thing? Does that need to change? We're often told that we shouldn't be, as legislators, dictating curriculum, which, again, that's fine, but can we tease that out a little bit and talk a little bit more about that? For me, as a new senator, it was really eye-opening to see what I could do, what I couldn't do, what historically is acceptable, what isn't. I think Representative Stone brought up this bifurcated system that we have, where we have these two sets of rules that govern our education system, public, and then sort of we call it independent schools or private schools. That system is riddled with inequities, which I don't necessarily have to go in right now. But one thing I think we need to ask ourselves is what is the cost of running these two separate systems? I can just tell you myself from my limited experience that I hope will continue in the future. But what are we spending on lawyers, and what is the law cost to navigating these two systems? What about time? What about resources? All of these things, they all add up. And then a lot of policies that we have that, frankly, I tried to put an amendment on the floor in the late stages of our session. One which would have said public dollars can't go out of state. And the other one which would have said private schools shouldn't be charging public tuition kids more than private tuition kids. These are small things. They're not huge amounts of money, but this is death by 1,000 cuts. And when you add up each pot of money, it is significant. And so I think we need to be talking about all of those things.
And as far as the commission, something that's important to me is there's a big spread of how much money it costs to educate, students, depending on where in the state they are, depending on which system they're in, right? Because unfortunately, your amendment did not pass, which said,
That's right.
You cannot charge more if you're in a private school. So for me, I'm hoping that the committee can really focus on what does that mean for student opportunity, those difference in cost. What are schools offering? Tax dollars should be translated into what is that money buying? So that's something I'm really happy to see, is that the Commission on the Future of Public Education, or whatever the long name was that we settled on, did make its way into the yield bill, so that policy is informing funding rather than funding informing policy. And so that's my hope, is that that commission will help translate what we are funding, what we're financing. The student experience and opportunity will be at the center of all decisions made when it comes to funding decisions.
Yeah.
I think we've mentioned a couple times now the bill, was it H-483? Was this the oversight of independent schools? And so this did not pass, or did it pass? No.
It passed the House, and then it just collected dust on the Senate.
So
the
could you
Senate
just talk a
wall.
little bit about what that bill
Never
was
went to the
trying to
floor.
do, and a little bit more about that?
In a nutshell, it was to go back to what Senator Gulick was saying. It was to provide better oversight of independent schools, because right now we have two systems, and just to better ensure that if you are receiving public dollars, that you're playing by the same rules. It had protections in there for our historic academies. It allowed people to come to come on board. If they said, we will play by the rules, then okay, great, you can be a part of this. But unfortunately, it did not pass through the Senate, but it did through the House. But it was just to pretty much ensure that if you were receiving public dollars, that you were adhering to the same rules.
Yes. And I would just add, I think it's extremely frustrating when you're trying to navigate the system as a legislator, to hear from constituents and to hear from folks across the state, well, private schools are doing a better job at X, Y, and Z. And then you look at what you're working with and you see Title 16, which is the governing set of statutes for public education, which is very long and very dense. And then you see the 2200 series, which is basically just like this fairly short document, which are the governing rules for independent or private schools. And you think to yourself, wow, the outcomes may be different. And I'm hearing this from my constituents across the state, but of course the outcomes or the perceptions are going to be different, because you have these two very different governing structures for these two separate entities. So people should not be surprised that things are different in the two worlds.
Right. And I think also that the LEA, is responsible. So the local education I think it's authority, is the agency, okay, is responsible for any student that does go to an independent school. They're responsible for making sure, that they meet certain regulations and stuff, but then it stops. We don't have the capacity at the AOE to kind of look at what are their discipline records, what are their attendance records, what grades, are they learning? So we don't have a lot of information that we do in the public school. We can be very accountable to the public about, what the student performance is, and with the independent schools we don't, and that's very concerning to me because that's taxpayer money.
Taxpayer accountability.
Right.
Yeah.
Can you speak, Senator Gulick, to why this bill did not move forward in the Senate?
That's a really good question.
We ask that at the end of the session all the time.
I think, we have in the Senate, we have small committees. So we have a committee of 6. I often felt like it was 2 of us, we were in a minority in our very sort of passionate support for public education. And there were a lot of bills that just never came up for a vote in committee. So of course, they never came up onto the Senate floor for a vote, which was unfortunate because I think, even if you don't necessarily like a bill, it seems like it behooves you as a senator to allow the body as a whole to weigh in on it. I just feel like that's kind of part of our job as legislators, is like to sort of keep our own bias out when we can and allow the body to speak. So that was unfortunate. We never got to vote on it in committee.
And a lot of this requires political fortitude. I mean, as somebody who grew up as a queer Arab American woman in the South, I will say I was quite shocked to learn where our public dollars are going. I didn't know until I sat down in the committee that we are publicly funding schools that are openly homophobic, that really segregate children out, based on their socioeconomic status, et cetera. And I think it's because of this idea that, we are in Vermont, we're in a snow globe of exceptionalism, and sometimes it's hard for us to admit that we may not be that much different than places that I grew up, like Alabama. And so I think part of it is just stepping into those areas of discomfort and then having the political fortitude and will to press forward and lean in and create change where change is needed. But it's a hard conversation, especially in the world of politics, when people are fearful of getting reelected just by raising these difficult conversations that shed light on things that are not so savory. Yeah.
Let's move on now to state construction aid. This is something that you mentioned, Senator Gulick. So for the past, I guess it's almost 20 years, the state has chosen not to, or maybe I won't explain it because I really don't have the means to, but could maybe Senator Gulick, if you could sort of explain how we got here in terms of how we pay for renovating and constructing and repairing our schools.
Yeah, so my understanding is that prior to 2007, the state would assist municipalities or school districts, really, which are their own entities, in paying for construction, maintenance, infrastructure costs, but then also, renovations. I can't speak to like a completely new school because I don't think there has been one in over 30 years. So, and frankly, I would call that kind of like a carrot to get the voters to, when it comes up for a vote in their community, to vote favorably for that particular bond, because that's what it's going to be, right? It's going to be your community bonding for the work. And when the state was able to say, we're going to help you, we're going to give you 20%, or we're going to help you with that 30%, or even in the form of loans or whatever it might be, I think it just made it more palatable for our communities to invest. When that was stopped in 2007, we found that districts were really having a hard time. They would sometimes put these items on a ballot, And they would go down because it did mean an increase in property taxes. Often, they wouldn't even make it to the ballot because, frankly, districts were torn between, do we lose these 3 teachers that we love? Do we lose this program, or do we invest in our HVAC system? We know HVAC is not sexy. It's not going to excite the community in terms of like educating their kids, but it is a necessity. And unfortunately, it went by the wayside because of at least partly because there was no assistance from the state.
Anything to add about state construction aid and what this bill is aiming to do?
I mean, the reason that in 2007 it stopped is because, like you said, the state had reached its bonding capacity, and so this new model proposed in the bill that did pass through regarding school construction would not have the state bonding, but just contributing its part to the local bond, using a yet to be determined funding source. It could be something like sports betting, perhaps. So it's also important. I am a Burlington rep, but something I've heard and appreciated from around the table is that large districts like Burlington, even though it's really hurt, I can say that from experience looking at my tax bills, large districts are usually the only ones who have been able to bond. Our smaller school districts have not even had the capacity to bond, yet their schools are falling apart just as much as some of these larger schools. So that's another reason that this bill that we passed to look at school construction a bit differently is so incredibly important, because the system we have in place right now isn't working for anyone.
Yeah, it really is an equity issue. Yeah. And I think when we talk about construction aid, we also, when we think back to that commission, we have to be looking at, well, what is the landscape like in that community? We hear stories about a public school that's half empty because half of the kids that would be there are going to a private school down the street. That's not efficient. That's not going to be cost effective for us taxpayers. So what do we do about that? Also, I think we were looking at, when we were talking about school construction, really trying to focus on and support those districts that do have an enrollment that is fairly robust, and a school that is, that is full, and if they're not, then, possibly looking at other ways to combine or work with other communities to really get that, to be able to offer the many opportunities that they can offer, and to make sure that we're investing as a state in a school that is, again, robust, that is full, and that will continue to look that way in the future.
Yeah, do you want to add?
I just want to add that this is like a continuum, because in 2021 we had an Act 72 where we did an assessment. We had an assessment on all the schools in Vermont about what their, where they were with deferred maintenance and new construction needs. And what came back from that report was that there's $300 million needed over 20 years, almost per year, to address our facilities needs. So then from Act 72, we went to Act 78 in 2023, and this was the School Construction Task Force that came up with a very good report. In terms of it really, to me, looked at school construction in a different way, to look at what levers could could the state use to kind of guide schools in, looking at consolidation, or looking at efficiencies, or looking at, sharing resources among supervisory unions, kind of thinking about how can we provide a good education but just do it more efficiently. So it just talked about some of the key proposals were centralized school construction aid program, prioritized by state educational goals, which is good because the report that will come back from the commission will help guide, I think, and inform, some of the school construction as well. It will be tied together and won't be like a siloed type of thing. Again, efficient use of funding, and just this idea of being innovative and collaborative, making sure CTEs, tech centers are involved in that conversation, but also being able to use it as an opportunity to kind of look at how we want to deliver education, what the buildings need to look at, and then kind of use this as a lever to encourage schools to, do really good planning for the future.
And one thing that so there definitely has been methodical implementation of a plan for school construction since Act 72. One thing I really appreciate about this bill is that one of the task items for the task force is to come back with legislation. So oftentimes, personally, I'll say when I hear task force, I'll roll my eyes because I'm like, oh my gosh, are we kicking the can down the road? But this one of their task items is to come back with legislation to address this critical issue. So I'm pretty excited to come back in January if I'm reelected and see what this task force has come up with.
You talked a little bit about local control and the way that sometimes impacts, it can be expensive. Between the challenge we're facing as far as the increase in property taxes and then also the significant need to repair and renovate our schools, do you foresee that if local control is less a part of the future of the public education system, that might lead to some current schools operating closing down or being consolidated into larger districts?
For me, again, the end result is how do we provide a quality education, equitable, sustainable, affordable to every student in Vermont, and then kind of look at how do we do that, and whether it's local control or it's more of a centralized system or a foundational, funding would kind of be the levers or be the mechanism that we use to come up with that outcome of all our students being educated with the skills and knowledge and understandings that they need to be successful. So it's kind of looking at it from a different lens. I mean, if local control in certain situations, helps that and is affordable, but I think we're going to have to look at everything. Everything will need to be on the table.
And then you mentioned, Representative Austin, BOCES. Can you tell us what those are and what that bill?
Yep, I wrote down because sometimes I'll forget, but it's boards of cooperative education. Yes. So it is a way of supervisory unions joining together, throughout the state, let's say 3, and sharing services, sharing busing or sharing buying paper towels or, just
education.
Special
Special
education education like services. And David Young, who is the superintendent or past superintendent of South Burlington, I talk to him when I have an opportunity, and he has this great idea also of kind of like a BOCES, but of staffing. So you have 3 supervisory unions that join together and maybe, share an ELL teacher or share an art teacher that moves around, let's say Burlington, Colchester, and South Burlington, so that you can hopefully maybe lower the cost, because the highest cost is 80% of the cost of, funding schools is the educators, and the most important thing of advancing learning is a good teacher. So it's a really good investment, but just how can we do it more efficiently and a bit smarter?
Well, and I think one of the great things about the BOCES is that you can share employees like that. That is one of the reasons why we wanted to do it, especially with like speech and language pathologists. There's a shortage. We don't have enough. And to be able to share those incredible professionals amongst various schools and various districts will be really helpful. But I do have to say that there were folks, at least in the Senate and in my committee in particular, who are a little bit concerned that BOCES is going to be like an added level of administration. And when it comes to spending, I do feel like that administrative cost and administrative burden is something that we need to look closely at. And like supervisory unions, for example, I mean, that's just a very complex kind of grouping of schools and school entities. So again, with the commission, I hope they look closely at this, but when it comes to, do we take out and take away teachers, or do we look at being more efficient in terms of administration? I think that's something that we need to do. That's really important.
We've also, just jumping back a little bit to sort of school renovation needs, and in Burlington, we saw that PCBs led to a huge bill for a new high school that we're now seeing constructed. What was done this session on PCB testing in schools?
Our favorite subject.
Yeah, why don't you start and I'll add, or I can start and you add.
Yeah.
What'd you like me
Well,
to
that's kind
start?
of how it happened. The
Yeah.
House started
Right.
with the bill that we were
It's true.
really hopeful about, and it did pass the House with great support. And that was to basically, I'm just going to distill it down, to raise a flag if there was not enough funding left in the pot to pay for remediation, testing, et cetera. Because that's the way it is right now. I'm a healthcare worker. I work as an occupational therapist when I'm not wearing my power suit in the State House. And I keep comparing PCB testing and remediation to being like bringing someone in and forcing them to go through a cancer screening and say, you must come in because it's really important. We care a lot about your health. And then to say, well, you've got cancer, but our oncology team isn't going to be here for, I don't know, a year, 2 years. And guess what? Your insurance didn't cost for that screening I just made you take. And there's no funding to pay for any of the treatments that you need. That's what PCB testing and remediation, the quote program that we have in place right now is like. And so the bill that we passed through the House, again, would be to raise a flag to say, hey, there's not, we're running down on the pot of money, so you may want to come up with another plan if you want to continue with testing and remediation. But that went to the Senate, and unfortunately, did not pass. And none of this is due to the lack of effort from the woman beside me, because she is a fierce champion for public education and for Burlington and did an incredible job. But you're not a one-woman show over there.
Right. Yeah. Unfortunately, the legislature is a communal effort, and one person really can't do it alone. So thank you for that. I was excited about that bill. It seemed really rooted in common sense. And I spent a long time on my floor report because I thought I was going to get to do it, but in the end it went to a different committee and never really came out. So that was disheartening. I've lived the PCB debacle, if you will, the PCB story from sort of the beginning, with BHS being sort of like the guinea pig here. So it's near and dear to my heart. I always said when I was on the school construction aid task force, our North Star should be having toxin-free, poison-free schools. And frankly, all of our buildings should be poison-free. It's a question of how do we get there, and who is going to pay for it? Because the three of us heard story after story after story of trials and tribulations that our superintendents and our principals are having to endure, not to mention our students and teachers. Really, really difficult. And as Sarita said earlier, we need our kids in school. We need them to be there. We saw during the pandemic what happens when they are home. And in Burlington, they were home for double the amount of time, if not more, because of our PCB shutdown on top of the pandemic. So, we lost some kids who never came back, which will always break my heart. I hope we continue to look at this. I hope we continue to find ways to fund it. Frankly, I hope the Monsanto lawsuit ends up in a very successful result, because they are the folks who should be paying for this and not the taxpayers of Vermont. And our schools should not be suffering because of this as well.
Anything to add? Awesome.
Yeah, just, it was interesting to me. It reminds me a little bit of COVID in a way, because this bill, I remember I was first-year legislator, and I was in my second year, and this bill came over maybe a week before the session was ending. I think Burlington had just, found out that they had this huge PCB issue. And so we kind of very quickly, passed this bill about PCB testing and remediation. And it was because we didn't know. It was like we didn't know how it was cancer causing, how detrimental or health-wise it was to teachers and children. So we passed this bill very quickly. And then over time have come to learn, there aren't a lot of states. I don't know if Vermont is the only state in the nation doing PCB testing.
We are. We may be the only one.
So we
in the
didn't have
world,
any. We didn't have time to look at any other states. We didn't really have time to get some really good expert testimony on this. So we got ourselves into a situation with good intentions. Worried about the health and safety of our teachers and children. But that is turning into a very difficult piece of legislation to implement because of the range of funding costs that could occur. We don't know what's out there, and we don't know what remediation. And I think of it with COVID too. I think we reacted very quickly with COVID, with masks, with sending kids home, because it was a novel virus. Like, we didn't know, and the intention was to keep families and children and teachers safe. So it's just an interesting, what lessons can we learn when we don't know, when it could be a health issue or a safety issue and we don't have enough data to make an informed decision. What side do we err on? How do we err? So it's just an observation of mine in 2 incidents recently that we didn't have enough data, I don't think.
Was Burlington the first high school in the country to close down because of PCBs? Was there any? Do we know if there's any precedent for that? Or
It's a really good question. I don't know. I can't answer that with certainty, honestly.
it's a challenge. It really is. So maybe now we'll move on to talk a little bit about the leadership of the Agency of Education, and there was a vote there was an appointment. Governor Scott nominated nominated Zoe Saunders to be the Secretary of Education, and that vote failed. And I think the question here so Senator Gulick, you're the one on the Senate side who actually voted there. The House doesn't have a say, as far as I'm aware, on appointments, right? That's the Senate.
Correct.
But just what is the role of the Secretary of Education, and what are you looking for in a Secretary of Education? What does the state need right now in terms of leadership there? If you can,
I'm happy to chime in. So the Secretary of Education, to me, it's a critical position. I think that person really sort of sets the tone for education in the state. That person also is the head of the AOE, the Agency of Education. So incredibly important position, works, for the governor, frankly, at the behest of the governor, so to speak, but also obviously has major impacts across the state in terms of what education will look like. So I was on the Senate Education Committee, and we were the committee that did the initial hearing or interview, if you will, of Zoe Saunders. And initially, that interview was pushed off about a week, which gave Ms. Saunders an opportunity to meet folks and chat with folks and sort of get to know the lay of the land a little bit, which was nice. So we had all had an opportunity to meet her before she came in, and then we had questions that we had all formulated. We hadn't talked about them together as a group. We all sort of did that on our own, and then we took a couple hours in an afternoon to interview her. And I took my role really seriously. I really want to give folks the benefit of the doubt. I really believe in looking at best intentions whenever I can. At the same time, in the back of my mind, I knew the importance of this position, and I wanted to make sure that I did my due diligence as someone who I felt had a really important role in the process. So I had a variety of questions, and I asked them in committee. And I felt that Interim Secretary Saunders, seemed like a nice person to me, was personable. We had some really nice interactions with each other, but, she did not answer my questions in a way that I thought showed her knowledge, showed her expertise, showed her experience. So there were a lot of words, a lot of jargon, but
Could you share one or two of the questions that you
well,
asked?
yeah, for me, one of the most important ones, there were many, but one of the most important was when I asked what vision she had for education in the state of Vermont. And again, lots of words thrown out, but I did not get any kind of a coherent vision for the state. And that was very disturbing for me because really any job I take, any job I've ever taken in my life, I always went in with a vision. I wasn't necessarily successful in implementing it, but I had some kind of a vision as to what I wanted to achieve, what I hoped to see at the end, how I was going to improve things. And it was just, as one of my colleagues said, that was a softball pitch and it should have been hit right out of the ballpark. Didn't happen. So that was very, very discouraging to me. And then there were frankly, a lot of other questions. I was really curious how, in her time in Florida, she had sort of pushed back against some of the very detrimental policies, such as don't say gay, for example, book banning, things like that. No clear answer again. She said that she had been happy to work for a gay mayor, which was a nice thing for her to say, but again, it didn't show me that there had been proactive work or efforts on her part to push back against some really deleterious policy in Florida.
You've said it all, but what I will say is that the process that has taken place regarding this appointment has been incredibly destabilizing during a time when we need stability in public education more than ever. And so I can say that as someone I did sneak over to the Senate to listen as the deliberation was happening on the floor. Yes.
Public.
But I was in the balcony. But I will say just the process or lack thereof has been incredibly destabilizing to the public education system. Yeah,
well, I think I would like to, if it's okay, I think I'd like to tease that out because one of the things I would say is that in terms of from where I was sitting, I thought the process that we had was actually very professional. We remained as objective as we could. We remained professional. We were so. I think you're talking about something a little bit different than what I'm talking about.
Yes, the fact there wasn't anyone appointed.
Right.
The search process wasn't even started until late last summer. Right. We were without a Secretary of Education, candidate even, for close to a year. And then the fact that I really was thankful that our senators uplifted and elevated the will of the voters when they said, this is a lovely woman, but she is not the person for the job. And before y'all even walked out of the chamber, the governor had reappointed her as interim secretary. That's what I mean about the process feeling really destabilizing, not only to me as like a legislator in the building, but to me it felt destabilizing to democracy writ large.
Totally agree. And I had over 600 emails. I had calls. I had letters written to me. I mean, the public really did engage in this in ways that I haven't seen before. And to Representative Stone's comment about the larger process, not just the process that we had like in our committee, for example, but for the governor to appoint a Secretary of Education that does not have the consent of the Senate is very problematic. It is extremely problematic, not just for education in Vermont, but for democracy. Yeah. We have checks and balances for a reason. And so I think for a lot of us, we're very dismayed by the choice that was made.
I just want to echo that. I mean, when I heard of the choice that the governor made, I was baffled. I mean, it wasn't her that I was concerned about her matching with Vermont and the culture of Vermont and the kind of ethos of education in Vermont, but it was like, I feel like Governor Scott is a smart man. I think he loves Vermont, and for him to not recognize where we were struggling so much this year with education. You know, there were three people that he could have chosen from. And, you know, I have to believe he either was just totally unaware, which I find very hard to believe, that this choice would be destabilizing, or I don't know, again, I don't know what he was thinking in not only where we were, but what kind of match was this for Vermont. So that really concerned me more about the governor than about the secretary.
What's the next step so we have an interim secretary that now does not have the support of the Senate. What's the next step as far as finding a permanent secretary? Is that in Governor Scott's hands?
I don't know what the process is now, do you?
So the next legislature, when they come back in January, will have to vote again on the secretary. That will probably happen sometime in February. In the meantime, it's well within the legislature's power to come up with some legislation that will further define this system and this process. As Representative Stone said, it was a process that seemed destabilizing and not very well defined. So I think we all feel that needs to be teased out a little bit more. Do you want to speak to any other options there are? There are obviously there is litigation that could occur around the Secretary of Education as well.
I think we have just a few minutes left, and I want to end on a slightly higher note, which is a bill S-191, which is a bill that makes resources available for folks who are not citizens to be able to access education resources. Could any of you, I don't know who's
That
the
came
best
from
person
the
to
House too.
Yeah.
speak to this bill.
Yeah, we went back and forth on this. I don't think it was that anybody was really opposed to it. It was for the children, I think, of migrants and new Americans and people that didn't have a Social Security number that they needed before this bill passed, to receive funding, for their education or their children's education. And I think there was a lot of federal issues to untangle. And it wasn't that people didn't want to do it. It was just dealing with the federal legislation and the state legislation and, how to make it work. But I don't know, I got an email from Migrant Justice. They were so happy, that this had passed, that their children can. I just went to the CCV graduation on Sunday, which is just one of my favorite graduations because it just is so inspiring to see these new Americans, these parents of first-gen students who are graduating college. It's just, I felt like it was like really America the way I wanted to see it. So it's just one little step, towards that.
Yeah.
I'm the daughter of an immigrant, and my dad actually came to America and pursued higher education and now teaches as a professor. And so this bill for me was really quite personal to ensure that Vermont residents, regardless of immigration status, not only have access to in-state tuition, but to the financial aid that so many folks need and deserve access to. And this contributes to a bigger thing. This helps workforce recruitment and retention and development in the state. It creates and fosters a better sense of belonging and diversity in this state, which is one of the reasons I ran for office. It's one of the reasons that I've chosen to be here in Vermont. So for me, S-191 is a wonderful, bright, brilliant spot to end this segment on because it is one of the most beautiful bills, I think, that passed through our chamber.
Yes, and one last thing I wanted to add that we heard a lot in the Senate, on the Senate side, was that there are folks in the state who are desperate to work and they are not able to because they are lacking a certification or some kind of, credential that they needed. And this will allow them to receive that credential that they need to get working. And that is exciting for everybody.
Thank you all so much for
Thank
joining
you.
us on
Thank
Under the
you.
Dome. Appreciate it. And thank you for tuning in to Under the Dome. We've got maybe one or two more episodes left here. but we're wrapped up in the legislative session. And is the veto session this week? Or
No,
next week?
June 18th.
June 18th. Okay.
17th.
Just kidding.
17th.
Hopefully it won't be the 18th.
Could be
too,
18th.
but
17th.
yeah, there
Hopefully
we
we
go.
will. But we may be.
All right. So June 17th will be the when the legislature reconvenes to reconsider some of the bills that the governor might have vetoed, probably will veto, has vetoed. Thank you very much for tuning in so long.
Thank you.
Thank you.